We've been talking about permaculture here on the Pray Just Plant podcast, and today we're going to be talking about the most utilized, the most popular design aspects of permaculture, the food forest. We're going to be talking about what it is, the 3 different types or designs. Did you know there was 3 of them? And the benefits. Why is a food forest something that you should be using and utilizing on your homestead? Let's get growing. Hello and welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast, the show that talks about growing a garden, a homestead, a healthy family, and most importantly, growing closer to God. I'm your host, Crystal Media, owner of the Red Ridge Farm Homestead, where our mission is to help women of faith find the courage to grow healthy food for their family while building a closer relationship with our Lord and Savior. That's you. Don't let the world hold you back. Pray Just Plant. Welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Media, and today we're going to be talking about a food forest. Over the past season, we've been talking about permaculture and permaculture design, and one of the greatest assets, one of the greatest design elements that a lot of people do when they're first starting out in permaculture is a food forest. It's something that can be very easily utilized on the homestead and in the backyard or in many different areas because it's very simple. It's a very simple visualization. We can see the forest. We can utilize the ideas from the forest very readily. A lot of people, when they're first getting into permaculture and permaculture design a food forest. Or if you're taking courses or learning about permaculture, they usually include some kind of information about a food forest because it is such an easy way to bring permaculture design to the homestead or to the backyard. So what is a food forest? Well, the dictionary actually says a food forest or a food garden is a garden that mimics the structure of a natural forest with multi-layers of plants stacked vertically to increase overall production. A food forest essentially mimics a forest with its multi-layers. It brings in the trees, it brings in the shrubs, it brings in the different layers of a forest. Now, I'm sure back in elementary, when you learned about the rainforest, you learned about the canopy and many of those different layers. But that can translate not just to a tropical forest, but it can translate to all types of forests. Even here in Wyoming, we have pine forests up on the mountain. Even in the U.S. Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of temperate forests and classic forests. There's many forests that we can learn from, and each of them are going to have different aspects as in their different layers or how tall their layers are. In the rainforest, those trees are hundreds of feet tall. In the Pacific western part of the United States, we have many trees that are really tall. And even in Africa, there's forests in Africa. There's the rainforest in the center of Africa, but even out on the Sahara, there is small forests. And those are going to tie in when we get to the 3 types of forests in just a minute. But the basis of a food forest is that we utilize that design that God made of a way to feed the forest through its different layers. So you have 7, in fact, normally in a forest. So there's the tall canopy trees. Then there's the mid canopy trees. Then there's going to be the shrub level. Then the non-woody plant level. And then you're going to have the ground cover. And then you're going to have your root plants and plants that grow and produce products from their roots. And then you're going to have your vining plants. Those are the basic layers. And I'm going to unpack those layers in just a moment. But I want you to really be thinking about the aspects of a forest and what those different layers do to create abundance. Number 1, those really tall trees, what do? They help shade some of the ground. And in a really dense forest, they are the ones that get probably the most sun. But then those plants, in a way, feed the rest of the plants. Then you have your mid-canopy trees. These are the ones that are going to grow just below the really tall trees in more spacious areas that the taller trees aren't quite blocking them out, because a forest is never just one type of tree. Even in our Rocky Mountains or even in our Bighorn Mountains, we have 2 different pine trees that grow, and we have aspens that grow in our forest. I think those are the three basic ones, but each of them have their different levels or how tall they grow. We have a certain pine tree that grows very skinny and we call lodgepole pine trees, and they grow very vertically. They're very skinny, they're very vertical. And then we have a few more spruce type trees, and they're more bushy and they're more spread out. And then we have the shrubs, and these shrubs are going to be creating protection for wildlife, going to be covering the soil. They're going to be doing lots of things to help protect the area around the base of a tree. Another thing trees do is they shed their leaves every fall. Pine trees also shed slightly, but if you are in a forest that doesn't have a lot of leaves, that's where the shrubs come in. They're going to be shedding their leaves every fall, and then they're going to be producing organic matter in the ground. This is going to help those ground cover and root crops. And then the non-woody plants, the grasses, a lot of the plants that the herbivores of the forest eat. And then you have the climbing vines. There is all of those aspects in a forest, and we can utilize that structure, that forest structure, to help ourselves design something on our homestead that can feed itself. Because we take and unpack that structure of a forest and we change it to a food forest. So instead of having trees that don't produce fruit, like pines, and lodgepole pines are great for lumber and things, but a food forest is where we have those same layers, but in those layers, and not every single layer has to be food for us. It could be food for the bees. It could be food for natural habitat or animals to help. One of the greatest parts of permaculture is when we create a natural environment, we can bring in predator type bees or predator type animals that can get rid of pest type animals or pest type things. So by having a place where rabbits can thrive that's not in our garden, we can actually create a place away from the garden. They're already thriving in our food forest, so why do they need to go to the garden for more? So creating this forest in our backyard, on our homestead, creates that ecosystem as well as create food, because we can place different trees in this system or different plants in this system that can not only create food for others, for the nature and food for the trees themselves, but we can create food for ourselves. A forest is based on trying to create enough food and organic matter to keep those big, huge trees alive. And there are huge trees in forests. So having that system, we can transfer it into a smaller system, but we're still creating the wood debris, the leaves are going to fall. We're still creating those basic layers so that we're creating and mimicking that abundance as well. And all we're doing is substituting a few of those trees with trees or plants that actually produce food for us. An example is maybe the tall canopy trees, you can do two different types, and the mid canopy trees, you can do two different types of apple trees or fruit trees, because we have the standard apple trees that grow quite taller than the dwarf apple trees or dwarf fruit trees. So that could be an example there. Or we can have the shrubs be raspberries because they're a woody plant, or we can have them be another plant or currants or something that produces a berry. And then we can go into the non-woody herbish plants. Those could even they could be a perennial, or they could be an actual garden plant. You could be putting in your lettuce or any type of vegetable you want to just grow as an annual that is a herbaceous plant that can be feeding you. A vining plant can be easy. You could make it grapes, that would be a perennial. You could make it pumpkins, because pumpkins would be an annual, but it's still going to vine. It's still going to spread out. Or pumpkins even could be a classic ground cover, because pumpkins spread, depending on the variety you get. If you get a vining one, you can get them to spread really far. A root crop can be something that you harvest yourself, but specifically the basic structure of a food forest is simple, as long as you just are thinking about the layers. A very simple example of a type of food forest can be the three sisters in our garden even. And this has been something that the Native Americans have done for years. We have corn that is a tall crop. It grows very vertically. And then we grow a pumpkin that spreads out across the ground and creates a ground cover. And then you grow the beans or a vining plant that vines up the corn. This is a very simple copy of what's actually happening in a food forest. And yes, a food forest does not have to have all 7 layers. It can have just a few layers. But the essentiality of it is that we are mimicking the forest, especially if you're going to be establishing of trees on your homestead, to create them in a way that they begin to grow and support themselves. And I talk a lot about this in my an episode and a blog post that I did on a permaculture orchard. What's the difference between a regular orchard and a permaculture orchard? And a permaculture orchard, in a way, it doesn't match it to a T, and use all 7 layers, but it does use some of the layers that mimic the food forest. Another very simple idea about food forests are fruit tree guilds and the benefit of grouping certain trees together and certain plants together to support a guild where they work together. So those are just some examples. Those are kind of the basis of a food forest and defining what a food forest is. We're going to go into the 3 types of food forests right after this week's tip. This week's tip is brought to you by the Building Soil Health Handbook. This handbook was designed to help you take the guessing out of improving your soil, to help you become the expert your soil has been waiting for you to be. Many of us think that we're gardeners of vegetables and gardeners of fruits, but we're not. We are stewards of the soil. In this handbook, I walk you through the 4 steps I've used here at the farm to improve my soil. I want to help you become the expert that you never realized you could be. To grab your free copy, go to redridgefarm.org/resources. This week's tip is going to be all about soil testing. It is spring. We're ready to start getting out into the garden, but the first step that you should make every spring and every fall is to test your soil. It is very easy to do. I myself, for the longest time, always put it off because I thought it was hard. I thought it was expensive. I thought I wasn't a soil expert. How did I have the place or the know-how to do this? But the truth is, you need to understand your soil. Yes, there is the ideal soil, and I talk a lot about the ideal soil in my Soil is Your Foundation masterclass. How can you get to the ideal soil if you don't currently know what's going on in your soil? So my tip this week is for you to get out there and test your soil. And don't do one of those big box store little pill soil tests where you've got the little, they're like little containers and you pop open this pill and you get a little bit of soil sludge and you shake it up really well. I did that for years and they're not accurate. They are just a waste of money because if you really research soil testing, it's not as expensive as you think. And in fact, for myself locally here, I found a place for free. I avoided doing a soil test for years when I found that it was free. I thought it was expensive. No, it's free. I thought it was hard to read. No, there's people out there that will help you read it. And I do go through how to read a soil test in my Soil is Your Foundation masterclass. So make sure you're getting out there and testing your soil. Soil is something that builds on itself. Putting in amendments may not have an instant reaction. So you need to know what's happening in your soil so that you can reach that ideal soil. So we're talking about food forests and that a food forest is a permaculture feature that imitates the structure of a forest to make the most of space, soil, and sunlight in order to grow food efficiently, but also mimic nature. Permaculture is all about finding those designs, finding those things that God has already put into place and utilizing them for ourselves. So let's talk about the 3 types of food forests. Did you know there was 3 types? Previously in this episode, I talked about that there's 7 layers, but all food forests don't need all 7 layers. Just like around the world, forests are different. Food forests can be different also because we can mimic the different forests around the world. So the first type of food forest is called like an oak savanna. And what this mimics is those savanna forests. Picture the African plains and you are on safari or you're watching a safari on TV or on the Nature Channel and you can see grass going for ages and ages. But does it grow on and on? No. How do the giraffes work on the savanna? They don't bend down to eat the grass. They eat the forest. There's little forests between large patches of grass that the giraffes move to. Are these forests dense and packed full of different plants and all the 7 layers? No, they're not. These forests are a system that work together with grasslands. These trees are spaced out so that there's plenty of sun to reach the ground. The underground is mostly, the understory under these trees is mostly grasses and other herbaceous plants with only a few shrubs. This type of food forest can be utilized especially if you are trying to create shade for your animals, or maybe you're trying to create a wind type break, or you're trying to create a place in your garden that gets on the north side that you want just a few trees. This is a great example because you're not trying to create the full forest. You're only trying to create a small microclimate because these trees aren't going to be as tightly packed as a forest would. The trees are actually more spread out. And because what the basis of this forest, if you are going to be developing it for yourself, is you are trying to create shade, you're trying to create a small microclimate, but you're not trying to block out all the grass on the ground. You're not trying to get rid of all the plants that your animals can be utilizing. So this type of food forest will feature fruit trees or maybe nut trees and support trees, because in a permaculture forest, in a food forest, we also want to be thinking not just trees that we can create food from, but we got to think about support trees. And I talk about that in my permaculture orchard, that an orchard should not be a monoculture because that's what a normal orchard is. It's a monoculture. But if we have a polyculture where we're growing several different types of fruit trees or several different types of even apple trees, we can also include support trees. And what a support tree is something that benefits the other trees around it. It could be something that adds a nitrogen to the soil. It could be something that you can trim back every year and use in your compost pile to create compost for the other trees. A support tree is something that helps you create more abundance for your other trees. In this savanna type food forest, we have to also realize that these trees are going to be spread out a little bit more, and the canopy is going to barely touch itself. You can use any size tree in this forest, but the larger the tree, the more space you're going to need to mimic this oak savanna. So maybe you want a few smaller trees. But I hope you can kind of visualize that these trees are not part of a large system. They're more of like a tree guild out by itself, and there's only a few trees to support it. And your basis is you're still trying to, even though you're trying to bring trees into the aspect, even though you're trying to bring shrubs maybe, you're still trying to allow enough sunlight to reach the ground so that you can still grow pasture grasses between the trees, or even be doing annuals here, like traditional annual vegetables, because traditional vegetables need a lot more sunlight than plants that are naturally grown in a forest. So this is the type of food forest that you would be needing if that's the type of vegetation that you would like to put under the trees. Or if you are thinking about using them to help create shade for your livestock, or to be raising livestock on the grasses that are not drowned out by the shade of the trees, there will get a dapple. And in fact, this food forest creates a lot more edge because it's not as compact or as dense as a traditional forest. And so it's a great alternative to that dense system. Now, those are some of the pros of that, but a few cons is one downside is that this type of food forest will require more regular maintenance than other types to keep it set up the way you want. Just as an annual garden requires regular maintenance, this system is going to require you to visit it at least weekly, especially if you put annuals underneath there. But if this is something where you're only maintaining grasses under these trees, it may not need as much maintenance. And if you are running animals, I always have to beware. I have yet to put any shade in one of our pastures because we have goats. So establishing one of these food forests will take time, and you may have to keep parts of it fenced off for a while so that whatever animal you're choosing to grow does not also eat the food forest. Even deer can be a threat to this type of food forest because it's usually going to be out further in pastures and further from the home. The second type of food forest is called a recovering forest. If you have ever come up upon a forest that has just very recently, at least in like the last 5 years, had a large fire, you're going to notice that a lot of the bigger trees have fallen down or have been stripped, and a lot of young trees are growing and they're more spread out, and the ground is getting a lot more sunlight, and the trees are very scattered. And there's only very few very large trees. This is also like the savanna type forest because the canopy is not very close. There's going to be more areas with dense trees and shrubs that may not have been burned in the fire, and they're a little older, and they're going to create sheltered pockets of shade, but there's still going to be a fair bit of sunlight reaching the forest floor. Unlike an oak savanna, though, you won't find as much grass in the understory. You're going to find more herbaceous plants that can grow a little bit better in shade. So how can you mimic this in a food forest for yourself? Well, you can plant in clusters. You can plant 3 to 5 fruit trees or nut trees with a couple support trees close enough that their canopies will touch when mature, and add more shrubs and herbaceous plants, and you're not so focused on the grass. Between the clusters, you can add shrubs and a few standalone trees and edible herbaceous plants such as perennial vegetables or self-seeding annual vegetables, so that you're mimicking that recovering forest. The system's going to require regular maintenance. You're going to be able to run some livestock, but not as much livestock as you would in that savanna type system. But you could run chickens, you could potentially raise goats and pigs in this type of food forest if you manage them carefully. Like I said, pigs and goats can be very damaged to a forest, but you're going to have to manage the plants so that you can protect them from these animals. But eventually, once the trees get very mature, you're going to be able to raise these type of animals. So pros of this type of food forest, this recovering forest, food forest, you're going to have your pros. It's great for producing perennial food crops with self-seeding annual vegetables. Potentially, it will be good for chickens, and with careful management, pigs and goats, and less maintenance than an oak savanna food forest without livestock. And I think what I'm trying to say there is that in the savanna type food forest, you're going to need livestock to maintain the grass. You're going to need livestock to maintain the areas around it because you're just going to have so much area around them. So cons of this, though, is you can't produce as many annual vegetables here because you're going to be creating more shade. Annual vegetables, if you look up a sun chart on vegetables, you can really find that tomatoes, they need 12 hours of sunlight to 8 to 12 hours of sunlight. They need lots of sunlight. So a system like this is not going to give them enough. Now, this system is also not going to be as ideal for larger grazing animals like sheep and cows because they just won't have the room to maneuver between some of the trees, and the trees are going to be blocking out more of the grasses. This is, I think, the reason goats can be utilized here is because goats and sheep also eat more of the leaf type herbaceous plants. And I have seen this on my own homestead. We raise now cows, but we used to raise just horses and goats. And the what we thought was a weed because the horses wouldn't eat them, the goats loved. And I think sheep would love as well because they go for those bigger leaved herbaceous plants instead of just grass. It's still going to you're still going to have weekly maintenance, but you're going to have a little more stability because it's more of a food forest. And that brings us to the third type of a food forest, which is the mature forest. This is a forest that utilizes all 7 layers. This is a forest that has loads and loads of abundance. Because the two previous types of forests are both very open canopy systems where there's a lot of sunlight reaching the understory, even though you have a few trees, and you're planting trees that are going to be more widespread so that you're going to still get that sunlight. But in a mature forest, the canopy is it's close. You're going to be getting more filtered sunlight reaching the understory. Mature forests in the temperate world do still have open areas where large trees have fallen and created openings, and you're going to have a few places that's going to get a lot of sunlight, but most of the forest is very close canopy. You're also going to have more different types of herbaceous understory. So you're going to have more woody type plants and are very common in a mature forest. These are going to include things like raspberries could be utilized there, or any type of shrub that has a more woody leaf and stem. And this is where, when I talked about those different types of trees and the 7 layers, this is where you're going to be utilizing all of those layers. You can plant standard size fruit trees and then also put in a few dwarf trees to create that canopy, to create that closeness. And then you're going to have to find shade tolerant edibles like currants can be planted in the understory, some types of raspberries. I know this is a type of forest that I would love to plant behind our house because we live on a hill. Having the close-knit trees, I can create terraces, I can create something that can hold back the soil and create more abundance by 1, less erosion, and 2, slowing down the water. We've been really talking about here on the Homestead, here at Red Ridge Farm, of starting to put in berms and rows of trees in a way that kind of moves with the hill so that the trees hold on to the soil and also slow the water from moving down the hill so very quickly. Kind of like a berm kind of style, but the trees are what create the berm. I would not be able to do a mature forest. It would probably be more of like a savanna type forest. But if you're really trying to find a place that you're really trying to hold back the hill or hold back soil and create a very dense area, this is the type of food forest that you want to put on your property. And this food forest is going to be the least amount of regular maintenance in the 3 because essentially you're creating a forest. You're going to be putting in that forest things that you are not going to be having to take care of every single day because it's not going to get the sunlight. This forest is going to be full of those perennials. It's going to be full of those self-seeding plants. It's going to be full of plants and trees and shrubs and vines and roots that is essentially going to take care of itself to create the abundance. It's going to be a perennial forest, something that can mature and grow and keep growing year after year, where in the other 2 systems, the other 2 types, the savanna and the recovering forest, there's so much space, there's enough for sun that you can create more of those annuals. And the annuals is what creates the maintenance that you need weekly. So just really quick, I'm going to go through the pros and cons. I've kind of mentioned them, but I have a list here. So your pros, this is going to be great for producing fruit from those really large trees and the smaller standard trees to create the different canopies. And this is also great for creating more of a sustainable forest type activity. This is where you're talking about, where I mentioned before, where you're creating an environment for the rabbits so that you're not having to keep the rabbits from your garden. You're creating a forest or something that those rabbits can go to. You're creating a sustainable actual forest environment. Also, you're going to be focusing on perennial vegetables here and berries and other perennial crops. This is where your rhubarb is going to come in. Maybe not asparagus so essentially, because that's something that needs more sunlight and more being maintained. But this is where those different herbaceous perennials are going to come in. And I know that you're probably wondering what go in each layer. And I've given some few examples, and I promise that I'm going to share that with you in 2 episodes from now. We're going to talk about the 7 layers, actually focus in on those 7 layers and actually talk about what type of plants they are and what trees you could be thinking about, what shrubs you can be thinking about for each of these types of forests. But here I'm just talking about the basics. I'm just giving you some examples, some quick ideas. But this mature type of forest is going to be based on those perennials. It's also going to be low maintenance because perennials are low maintenance. Now you are going to have to establish this forest. It's going to take more time because you are putting in more plants. You're putting in more trees. You're putting in more of everything. So you're going to need to take time to establish it. You're going to need to take time preparing the soil. You're going to need to take time preparing the environment and making sure that your goats aren't getting in there, because you're going to be planting more than you would in those other different types. Now, a few cons of this is that you are not going to be able to do the traditional annual vegetables under these trees because they're just not going to get enough sunlight. And it's going to take a long time to establish. This is where you're going to be using, like I said before, though, you're going to be using those standard size trees. And a standard size trees may take 5 to 6 years to begin to produce fruit, where a dwarf tree is 2 to 3 years. So it's going to take time to establish. And it's not going to be ideal for most livestock. This is going to be something that's going to be more of small animal. Maybe you might be able to run chickens in there, but it's not going to be like the savanna or the recovery, especially the recovery for cows. It's not going to have lots of grass for the livestock, and it's just going to be too close for them to get in there, and they will actually create more damage to your forest in this type of forest. But one great aspect of this is that you can start small. You can easily combine these types of forests. Maybe for the next few years, you want to focus on just doing a few savannas. Well, you can do that. And then maybe you want to develop those savannas and add a few more shrubs or add a few more different layers, and you go into a recovery type forest. And then as that begins to establish itself, maybe you add a few more layers and you create that mature forest. So food forest can evolve on your property. You can choose an area to evolve it, or you can even have the different types of food forests all over your property. So those are the basic types of a forest, of a food forest. And we're going to get into the benefits of a food forest right as soon as we get back from the Growing with God segment, where you and I dive into the Bible and learn more about building that relationship with our Lord and Savior. This week in the Growing with God segment, we're going to be moving away from Ephesians. We're going to come back to it soon, but I just felt with all the things going on in the world, we need to build our confidence in the Lord. So we're going to be doing a Confidence in the Lord series till the end of this season. So we're going to be reading a verse and then talking about it and talking about how we can have, in a world full of doubt, we can have confidence in our Lord. So our first verse comes from Hebrews 10:35 through 36, 2 verses. So do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. You need to preserve so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what He has promised. For in just a little while, He who is coming will come and will not delay. I also read 37. We have a promise from God, a promise that He will follow through with what He says He will do. In just a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay is actually pulled from Isaiah. Isaiah is part of the Old Testament. So that means that is a prophecy of a time to come. And who is coming to bring the world together, to bring us to the Lord? That is Jesus Christ. And when we do not throw away our confidence, when we believe in that God is going to fulfill what He says He's going to fulfill, we can have hope, even in this world of desolation, mistrust, and strife. So I just want you to remember this week to have confidence in the Lord and have confidence on your growing journey. Growing food for your family is something that is completely apart from the world, just like believing in the Lord is apart from the world. So when you have confidence in what you're doing, that's going to spill out into many more aspects of your life. The same comes to when you have confidence in the Lord, you can have reassurance. You can have a peace that no one else can take away from you. We have been talking about food forests, what a forest is, the 3 essential types, and I promised to you that we would get into what type of plants you could be growing in this food forest in another episode. Is coming in a few weeks. Or if you're listening to this episode after that one has already aired, you can just skip to that one and you can really learn more about the different plants that go into those 7 layers. But right now we're going to be talking about the benefits of a food forest. The first benefit is that you can increase your harvest. Because what you're essentially doing is you're growing vertically. Even in a garden, you can increase your harvest by growing vertically. You're growing also in layers. If you, in your garden, like I mentioned, the 3 sisters, plant things in layers, you're going to be getting more abundance from that same area. Where you planted the corn, the green beans, and the pumpkin, you could have only planted corn and only got a corn harvest. But instead, you put in layers. By creating layers, you're creating more abundance. You're bringing more from the same soil. The other thing you're going to be doing is you're going to be increasing soil life. What happens in a forest? A forest naturally produces organic matter. Organic matter is the stepping stone, is the cornerstone, is the essential tool of healthy soil. So many times our society, the selling of fertilizers, the big box stores, the science, everything always points to amendments. Your soil needs nitrogen, it needs phosphorus, it needs potassium. And usually as growers, as someone who's not in a big industry, a lot of the times that we only focus on the big 3. And sadly, what the truth is those big 3 or all the minerals that are in soil to help our plants is only 3% of what your ideal soil needs to produce a garden, to produce fruit, to produce a food forest. Your soil essentially needs carbon. It needs oxygen. It needs water. That is the greater proportion of what an ideal soil is. And in my book, Dirt: Finding the Solution to Soil Health, I go through all of what your ideal soil should be and how you can really find out that amendments are pushed way too often and way too much, and that we as growers need to focus not so much on the amendments. And I'm not saying that we don't need amendments. Yes, they're 3%. We need them. But we also need the carbon. We also need the organic matter that supports the microorganisms. Because the way the soil functions is it needs the microorganisms to break things down so that it's available for the plants. And the plants need water so that those broken down bits can be put into the soil sludge, brought into the plants, and that's how they get the amendments that you add. For years, I focused on amendments. I would get my soil test and I played around with those cheapy soil tests for so long. I would get the soil test and be like, okay, it says I have enough nitrogen. It says I have enough of this. It says I have enough of that. And I did have organic matter, but I didn't have as much as I should have because I do grow in very clay soil, and organic matter is really hard to establish in clay soil because of the lack of oxygen. It also stemmed from the way I tilled my garden. I tilled it every year, and every year I disturbed the system. I killed microorganisms. I even increased the evaporation of water. I increased the release of carbon that these microorganisms need to grow. Because what a microorganism does is it needs carbon as a home. It eats carbon somewhat, but mostly it needs it as a home. And if there's not carbon in the soil or organic matter in the soil, it doesn't have a place to live. And then If it doesn't have a place to live, it can't establish itself and multiply to start digesting things in the soil to break it down. A food forest does this very simply. The trees lose their leaves every year. This creates organic matter. I want you sometime this season or sometime this year to get out into a forest, and I want you to dig down underneath the leaves, underneath the pine needles, and I want you to see how deep, dark, and black that soil is. And it all comes from the slow process of organic matter being added to the soil and allowed to slowly digest, and then allowed to become homes and a structure for those microorganisms, so the next year when those new leaves come down, it can slowly absorb them in. Also, another benefit is you're going to have less weeds and less pests, because what does a food forest create? It creates shade. And a lot of the times our weeds or things that we don't want to grow are actually need lots of sunlight. So it's going to reduce those, because in a food forest, in a forest essentially, you are and God plants that can survive and thrive in the shade. But what else you're also going to be doing is you're going to be creating closeness. When plants are close and kept close, they drown out any other plants, and then they can't be established. Weeds do not get established because, one, they don't have room to grow. And if you plant things like cover crops like strawberries or some nitrogen fixing, you can even do nitrogen fixing plants, you're going to create less weeds because you are creating a system that eliminates weeds. And you're also creating, because of the improved soil, because of the closeness of the plants, because you're creating an ecosystem that is not focused on one crop, you're creating a poly system. You are going to eliminate pests as well, because one, even in a garden, when you talk about companion planting, the one reason you do is because it confuses the pests. When a potato beetle is on the search for potatoes and you have 3 rows of them and it can find them very easily, they're going to hit your potatoes. Now, if you have, I'm not sure what you can grow with potatoes, but if you have something else growing very close to your potatoes and the scent of those potatoes is being masked or being not as strong, it's going to be less likely that those pests are going to find those plants. There's many other reasons to grow in companion growing. I've been reading a great book lately. It's on my to-read list that I really want to read. It's called Carrots Love Tomatoes, and it's all about companion growing in the garden. And you can take these same ideas of a food forest and take them to the garden, like we talked about with the 3 sisters. By bringing those plants closer together, you can create that shade. By bringing in other plants, you're avoiding that monoculture and you're creating a polyculture. Another benefit is you're creating, and I think we mentioned this before though, but you're creating a diverse harvest because you are planting several different types of vegetables. If you're doing the several even different types of forest, you're creating different benefits. If in a savanna, you're creating more grass for your animals because grass actually loves to grow in that shade, and you're creating edge and more things grow in edge. And I talk more about edge in my permaculture design series on the podcast and in my blog. And if you want to find any links for that, I'll include all the links in the show notes. So really quick though, what are the show notes? Well, the show notes are where you can find out more. Yes, in the description, I do include a few links, but in the show notes is where I may have wrote a blog post about what we talk about here, or I even have pictures. I've really tried to help you visualize the savanna forest, but maybe it'd be really helpful to look at a picture of one to help see it. And that's where you're going to find it, is on the show notes. It's a place where you can dive even more deep into the topic we're talking about. So back to the benefits of a food forest. You're going to be creating a diverse harvest because you're creating diversity. Also, there's going to be less maintenance, or you're going to be maintaining it in different ways. You're going to have, in the savanna type forest, you're going to be having their animals eating that grass. In the recovery forest, you're going to be maintaining annuals if that's what you choose to plant underneath there. And in a mature forest, there's going to be even less maintenance because you're letting nature take on what it normally does in a forest. So as you can see, there are many benefits to establishing a food forest on your homestead. Now, that is all I have for you today, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. I sure enjoyed finding out more about food forests. I have been slowly establishing one here on the homestead. I call it my fedge, and this is a forest where it's more like a hedge. I guess it would be more like the savanna type food forest. It's growing along a fence line, and it's slowly being established. We got the trees in a few years ago. Now we're getting the shrubs in, and I can't wait to grow some pumpkins this year and get some more of the actual beds established so that I can start doing some perennials and some annual vegetables. So I want to thank you for joining me here today at the Pray Just Plant podcast. And if this is your first time, I want to welcome you to the community of fellow growers here at Red Ridge Farm. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can DM me on Instagram or Facebook, or go to my contact page on my website. And even on my website, I've got several free resources that you can use getting yourself growing on your growing journey. Because our mission here at Red Ridge Farm is to help you grow a garden, a homestead, a healthy family, and closer to our Lord and Savior. And remember, don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant.